Exactly 80 years ago, the Red Army was advancing at full speed towards Berlin after having broken through the German defenses on the Vistula. Faced with the total collapse of the Eastern Front and the threat to which the capital of the Reich was increasingly exposed, one of the worst possible decisions was made, and Himmler was appointed Commander-in-Chief of Army Group Vistula. His mission was to stop the Soviet advance and, therefore, prevent the Red Army from getting any closer to Berlin. With this appointment, the German leader intended that Himmler would carry out all his orders without protest, and that he would apply very harsh measures with his own troops so that no soldier would retreat to the west. Just as Hitler intended, his subordinate did everything he was ordered to do, but it was not enough to stop Zhukov's advance. The most desperate measure that the Germans launched to prevent the Soviets from getting closer to Berlin was the so-called Operation Solstice, which we will now analyze in depth. It all began on January 12, 1945, when the Soviets attacked on the Vistula front and quickly broke through the German defenses. This frantic advance through Poland brought them to within just 70 kilometers of Berlin by early February. However, this penetration had not been carried out across the entire front line equally, and this caused the right flank of the First Belarusian Front, commanded by Zhukov, to be totally exposed to a German attack. So, faced with this situation, Zhukov began to debate with his generals what was the best decision to take. Continue towards Berlin, which at that time was unprotected as Zhukov wanted, or secure the conquered territory and consolidate his flanks. While these meetings were taking place, Stalin telephoned Zhukov on February 6th to ask him what they were doing. After Marshal Zhukov had explained the situation, Stalin told him to stop the nonsense and attack northwards in support of Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front. Furthermore, the Germans were still holding out in the Soviet rear in Courland and now also in East Prussia. General Guderian, who had been chief of the General Staff of the Army High Command since July 1944, had been calling for the complete evacuation of Courland for many months, and now he was also asking for a corridor to be kept open in Pomerania, which would allow the German units still in East Prussia to leave. His intention now was to concentrate all these troops in order to launch a major counterattack from Pomerania in a southerly direction, with the aim of cutting off the Soviet vanguards. This was also intended to stop the Soviet advance on Berlin, which the Germans believed was imminent. On the other hand, Himmler was dejected by the situation and now found himself in the role of having to continually inform Hitler of the failures he was experiencing on the battlefield. This made him increasingly look down on Hitler, and their relationship began to cool off considerably. In an attempt to gain the German leader's trust and regain prominence, Himmler kept talking about imminent counterattacks that his troops would carry out, although without specifying any in particular. With this, we arrived at a meeting that took place at the beginning of February, in which Guderian proposed launching this offensive, for which it was necessary to evacuate Courland and East Prussia, and also required the presence of the 6th SS Panzer Army that had just left the Ardennes. The idea was for a pincer attack against the vanguard of the First Belarusian Front to completely cut it off. The northern pincer would start from Pomerania, and the southern pincer from the sector near Küstrin on the Oder. The meeting between Hitler and Guderian went like this. You must believe me when I say that it is not obstinacy that leads me to propose so strongly the evacuation of Courland. I cannot think of any other way for us to accumulate reserves, without which we have no hope of defending the capital. I assure you that I am motivated only by the interests of Germany, Guderian told Hitler. How dare you speak to me in this way? Hitler shouted. Am I not fighting for Germany? My whole life has been nothing but one long battle for Germany. From this point on, the conversation between the two became more tense, until they managed to calm down and came to the conclusion that it was the best option they had. However, this operation would be launched with far fewer troops than Guderian had requested, as the total evacuation of either Courland or East Prussia was not approved, nor would the 6th SS Panzer Army be sent to the new front on the Oder. We must also point out that even if it had been approved, it would not have been possible to have these units ready in Pomerania to participate in the offensive, as the attack was about to begin imminently. Guderian also requested that Himmler not be the commander in charge of the attack, and instead proposed General Wenck. Himmler, for his part, was not able to assert his point of view, and the situation was completely beyond him. He knew that he did not have enough men, ammunition, or fuel to carry out the operation that was demanded of him, but he had no other option than to obey the order if he did not want to look bad with Hitler. At this time, Himmler still enjoyed Hitler's full sympathy, as reflected in the German leader's defense of him when Guderian continued to insist that Himmler be suspended from his military post. The conversation went as follows. "Himmler is capable of carrying the brunt of the attack on his own," Hitler said. "The Reichsführer SS does not have the necessary experience or a staff competent enough to control the attack without help. Therefore, the presence of General Wenck is essential," replied Guderian. "I will not allow you to tell me that Himmler is incapable of fulfilling his duty," Hitler ended by shouting. Finally, after further discussions, Hitler finally agreed that Wenck would help Himmler direct the offensive. On paper, the number of troops assigned to this operation was astonishing, as it was supposed to have some 1,200 tanks. In reality, however, this was far from the case, and most of them could not be transported to Pomerania, and those that were finally able to participate did not have the necessary ammunition or gasoline. Let us remember that the great offensive that was being prepared at that time was the one that began a few weeks later at Lake Balaton, which was intended to defend the capital of Hungary and the last sources of oil for the Third Reich. Thus, the German unit that was in charge of carrying out this mission was the 11th SS Panzer Army, commanded by the famous General Felix Steiner, which was made up of 11 divisions, 7 of which were panzer divisions. Again, one should not be fooled by the name, because for this operation, in total, they amounted to no more than 300 tanks of all types, with fuel and ammunition for just a few days of combat. The units that were finally available for this more limited offensive, which were to attack along a front of about 55 kilometers wide, integrated within the 11th SS Panzer Army, were the following. The right flank was formed by the 39th Panzer Corps, composed of the Holstein Panzer Division, formed just a few days before, the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, the 4th SS Polizei Division, and the 28th SS Volunteer Grenadier Division Wallonian, the latter commanded by General Leon de Grelle. This army corps would attack from the area surrounding the city of Stargard and head south towards the town of Döhlis. Its approximate armored strength is estimated at about 200 tanks and tank destroyers between the 4 divisions, of which at least 53 Panthers and more than 80 Panzer Weinvs. At the heart of the German forces was the 3rd SS Panzer Corps, commanded by General Martin Unrein, composed of the 11th SS Panzer Grenadier Division Nordland, reinforced with at least 12 Tigerist Coups from the 503rd SS Heavy Tank Battalion, the 23rd SS Volunteer Grenadier Division Nederland, the 27th SS Volunteer Grenadier Division Langemark, and the Panzerführer Begleit Division. Of all these units, the most striking is the last, which was an elite German unit whose original task had been to escort Hitler on his visits to sectors close to the front. The 3rd SS Panzer Corps, located right in the center of the German deployment, would attack southward toward the present-day city of Choszno, and after bypassing it, it would turn southwest. Finally, on the left flank was the Munzel Army Corps, with 2 infantry divisions, the 163rd and 281st, a tank destroyer brigade, and the Führer Grenadier Brigade. This last unit had been born out of the military detachment defending Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, known as the Wolf's Lair. Facing them were the Soviet 35th and 61st Guards armies, which would sell their hides dearly. The 16th of February 1945 marked the start of Operation Solstice, led by General Felix Steiner, with the ambitious aim of advancing from its positions in Pomerania towards Küstrin to cut off Soviet supply lines. The aim was for the 11th SS Panzer Army to advance some 70 kilometers to the south and annihilate the rear of the First Belarusian Front. The attack began under adverse weather conditions, with muddy terrain due to thawing and intermittent rain. German divisions achieved some initial successes, with the Holstein Panzer Division and the Frundsberg Division defeating 2 Soviet brigades, forcing them to retreat southwards. However, despite this advance, Soviet resistance with T-34-85 tanks complicated operations, and the German divisions failed to encircle the enemy troops as planned. In the central sector, the 3rd SS Panzer Corps, reinforced by powerful Tiger IIs, managed a penetration of between 8 and 12 kilometers, reaching the vicinity of Arnswalde. However, the advance was slowed by the muddy terrain. The arrival of Soviet reinforcements, including the feared IS-2 tanks with 122 mm guns, further hampered German progress. On the other hand, the Munzel Army Corps, on the German left flank, fared the worst, coming up against solid Soviet defensive positions, which left it virtually paralyzed and exposed the left flank of the 3rd Panzer Corps to possible Soviet counterattacks. By the end of the day, German advances were less than expected, and with the arrival of Soviet reinforcements, the situation looked complicated for the following days. The offensive, although initially surprising, failed to achieve the planned objectives due to the harsh terrain conditions and organized Soviet resistance. On February 17th, German forces resumed the attack, making some minimal gains, although the terrain and Soviet resistance again slowed their progress. The Nordland and Polizei divisions advanced the furthest, capturing Arnswalde and Dolisch, respectively. However, they failed to link up due to the arrival of the 2nd Guards Tank Army, which halted the offensive. At Arnswalde, German forces, including some Tiger IIs, repelled Soviet attacks while allowing the evacuation of civilians through a small escape corridor. Gradually, the offensive began to stall, leading Hitler to receive a pessimistic report from General Wenck. Shortly afterwards, Wenck suffered a traffic accident that left him incapacitated, leaving General Hans Krebs in charge of the operation. Bad weather, muddy terrain, and Soviet reinforcements further complicated the situation for the Germans, and the offensive began to fall apart. Himmler, seeing impending failure, fell ill and retired from command, abandoning the direction of the offensive altogether. By February 18th, the German offensive had lost momentum, and they were forced to go on the defensive everywhere. That same day, the German command decided to call off the operation, claiming that they were seeking to avoid unnecessary wear and tear on their troops, as fuel and ammunition shortages were severely affecting the 11th SS Panzer Army. Meanwhile, Soviet forces, which had received reinforcements, intensified their pressure on the small German salient. Following the Yalta Conference on February 11th, Stalin instructed Zhukov and Rokossovsky to attack northwards, with the aim of encircling German troops in Pomerania. Zhukov launched his offensive on 19, heading towards Stettin and using the 61st and 2nd Guard tank armies. The town of Arnswalde remained a focus of German resistance, but General Joachim Ziegler of the Nordland Division decided to evacuate it to avoid Soviet encirclement. On February 20th, German troops managed to get civilians and wounded out of Arnswalde thanks to the efforts of Nordlanders who held an open corridor. German forces began to retreat to defensive positions further north as the Soviets intensified their advance. Zhukov then resumed his attack, and by early March, the Soviet 19th Army had reached Kolberg and cut off German troops in Danzig. In strategic terms, Operation Solstice, although it failed in its primary objective of annihilating Zhukov's troops, did succeed in temporarily delaying the Soviet advance towards Berlin. This gave the Germans time to strengthen the defenses along the Oder River and prepare a longer resistance. Some historians, such as Christopher Duffy, argue that this operation contributed to delaying the fall of Berlin by several months, although the debate over whether Berlin could have fallen in February remains open. In short, Operation Solstice did not fulfill its original purpose of inflicting a significant defeat on the Soviets, but it did succeed in slowing their advance and forcing Zhukov and Rokossovsky to focus their efforts on Pomerania before continuing their drive towards Berlin. So, would you like to continue analyzing how the 7 offensives launched by Germany on the Eastern Front in 1945 went? Well, here they are in my book, whose link to the corresponding discount I leave in the description. I also leave you with the program about the Battle of Küstrin, which was basically what came next. Greetings to everyone, and see you next Sunday. See you soon.